So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's speaker series session, who is Dr. Cameron Mustard, who is the president of the Institute for Work and Health and also a senior scientist. And Cam will be reporting some first results on the Ontario Life After Work Injury Study, which is a unique cohort following up WSIB claimants 18 months after their injury. Cam, over to you.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome to all who are able to join us this first week of February, 12 months after the COVID-19 emergency laid its hands on us, both here in Canada and around the world. So, as Peter indicated, I'm going to give you some preliminary look at what we've learned so far in the Life After Work Injury Study. So by way of a little bit of summary of what I'll talk about today, I'm going to sketch out the objectives of this cohort. I'm going to offer some descriptions of what we call the sample design. It's important that this be understood as we proceed through some early findings. And then I'll close with some observations about some analysis that's currently in progress. At the bottom of this slide are the members of the OLAWIS study team. Okay, so this work, which is important in our view, was commissioned in the summer of 2018 by the Workplace Safety Insurance Board, who issued a call for proposals to illuminate our understanding of the experience of workers' compensation claimants after they're no longer receiving services from the WSIB, particular interests in what are the factors associated with positive and negative labor market outcomes, but also what about health and recovery outcomes after workers are no longer receiving services from the WSIB. It's an important question, one that I think across this country, few provincial workers' compensation schemes, representatives of workers and employers actually have good understanding of how do people do after they're no longer receiving services from the Provincial Workers' Compensation Authority. This slide is conveying some important information about decisions we made in designing this study about the sample design. We made a decision to, in the language of researchers, oversample lost time claimants whose period of service from the WSIB was longer than the average. So just to summarize what this slide is saying, for those lost time claimants whose wage replacement benefit duration was 5 days or less, we excluded those claimants from our study. That's about 30% of all lost time claimants were not eligible to be included in the study. Then we formed 3 sample groups, equal sized, approximately equal sized, and we recruited people in equal numbers for the purposes of being able to do good comparisons between these groups. So the 3 groups are a group of claimants whose benefit duration was 5 days to 3 months. That's about 50% of all lost time claimants. A group of claimants whose benefit duration was 3 to 12 months. It's about 10% of all claimants. And then finally, a group of claimants who had some degree of ongoing activity on their claim, 12 to 18 months post-injury. And there are multiple reasons for ongoing activity. It may be the continuation of wage replacement benefits, maybe enrollment in work reintegration, or ongoing entitlement for healthcare benefits or permanent disability award. And this group of people in the population of all lost time claimants represents about 6% of claimants. It's important to keep this characteristic of the sample design in mind as we go through the preliminary results I'm going to share, because these 3 groups are very different in terms of both their labor market outcomes and their health status as we go, as we'll show you over the next about 25 minutes, if you don't mind. Okay. The survey itself was administered to claimants who consented to share their contact information with us for the purpose of an interview. The survey was administered about 18 months after the claimant registered their lost time claim. Recruitment period was from June 2019 up until the first 2 weeks of March in 2020, when we stopped recruitment because of the way COVID-19 was abruptly and quite dramatically changing the world. The survey content is listed on this slide. We were interested in information on return to work with the at-injury employer, and then importantly, what people were doing in the world of work 18 months after their work-related injury. We asked questions about interactions with healthcare providers, interactions with WSIB case managers, and an important emphasis on workers' health and function, physical health, mental health, persistent pain symptoms, the prevalence of chronic conditions, some questions about sleep, which is, I think, an under-recognized sometime burden of long-term health consequences, and opioid, cannabis, and sedative use. So the first slide, the first group of slides, 5 or 6 here, are going to bring you some information about employment status and return to work among this group of claimants. And here this table is showing the 3 sample groups. Down at the bottom is a reminder of what the membership of these groups consists of. Sample group 1, the shorter duration group in terms of lost time benefits. Sample group 3, the group who have the longest period of services from the WSIB. So the first row provides information on how many workers, what percent of workers return to work with the at-injury employer. And about 90% reported to us that they did go back to work with the at-injury employer. And this aligns to the information the WSIB routinely publishes, a key performance measure, the proportion of workers who return to work with the at-injury employer with no loss of earnings at the 12-month mark. Okay, so it largely aligns with the WSIB's metric. When we asked people what they were doing 18 months later, you can see there's a lot of dynamic and change. 18 months later, 60% across all 3 groups reported to us they were still working with the at-injury employer. About 18% had changed employment. They were working with a different employer. And a group of people not currently working, ranging from about 15–16% in sample group 1 to about a third of people in sample group 3, told us that at that point in time, 18 months after injury, they were not currently working. Here's some of the reasons people provided for why they were no longer working with the at-injury employer. So that's 36% of the 1,100 workers told us at 18 months they were no longer working with the at-injury employer. And there's a diverse range of reasons here that people told us about. We've organized these reasons into 2 broad categories: voluntary and involuntary reason for separation. Voluntary is where the worker in the interview told us that they chose to terminate the employment. And that's about, I'm doing the math, 67% of these 400 people said, I chose to terminate employment. Of that group who chose to terminate employment, more than half of them said to us the reason they left the at-injury employer is they had concerns about their health. Either their health was preventing them, in their view, from working safely, or that the employer was unable to provide a suitable accommodation for their circumstance. The other category, involuntary employment, is where the employer terminated the employment or the contract had ended. And you can see here about 60 people told us that the employer had terminated their employment. The other group, about 75 people, said that there was no work available, their contract had ended. So this is an example of the important information that's available if lost time claimants are spoken to some period of time after their experience or services from the WSIB have concluded. A little bit of information about what people told us about what their return to work experience was like with the ad injury employer. And here the columns are grouping people into the 60% of claimants who told us they were still with the ad injury employer, about 15% of people who said they were working but with a different employer, and about 22% who told us that at 18 months they were not currently working. We asked claimants if the employer had provided an offer of modified duty. You can see there's a difference here across these three groups, but overall, let's do this. Almost 80% of people who were still working with the ad injury employer, almost 80%, told us that the employer had provided an offer of modified duty. We also asked people if they found the return to work experience stressful. So of that group of people who did return to work with the ad injury employer, you can see again some difference in terms of the degree to which people found this process, the return to work process, challenging. 30% of the people still with the ad injury employer, rising to about 50% of people who were no longer working at 18 months. We asked about financial difficulties during work absence. 3 response categories. There were no difficulties. There were some, but they were minor, or that the financial difficulties were very concerning and serious. And you can see here again that there are big differences across these 3 groups of claimants. What I'd like to emphasize is that just for you to all remember, sample group 1 is the group that's most representative of lost time claimants. It is sample group 2 and 3 who represent a smaller fraction of claimants, but for many reasons are having, we can see clear differences and greater difficulties in this case in terms of financial difficulties. So that was a sketch of employment circumstance, 18 months after work-related injury, and some information about return to work experience with the ad injury employer. I'm now going to turn to a different but important focus to share some information about the health status of workers following a work-related injury 18 months after their injury. And it was an important objective of this study. We have a range of health measures: physical health, mental health, perceived health status, the prevalence of chronic conditions unrelated to the work-related injury or illness. And where possible in this study, we've included information, we've included questions in the OLAWIS questionnaire that allow us to compare health status between the cohort members and working adults in Ontario who participate in the Canadian Community Health Survey, and I'll share some of that information in the following slides. So, self-rated health status. Those of us who've participated in health interview surveys recognize this question. It's simple. In general, would you say your health is fair, poor, good, very good, or excellent? And again, you can see here 18 months after the work-related injury that there are large differences, and they are to the negative direction among people in the second sample group and the third sample group relative to the group of claimants who had the shortest period of wage replacement benefits. This is important. These are differences that are substantial. This slide offers a comparison to working adults in the Canadian Community Health Survey who reside in Ontario. And it's just a comparison of the distribution of responses from excellent on the left to poor on the right. And I hope you can see that compared to the Ontario workers in the Canadian Community Health Survey, the OLAWIS participants are shifted substantially to the poorer health end of the spectrum. And this is 18 months after a work-related injury. Okay, question about sleep quality. The Canadian Community Health Survey, helpfully, has some good questions about sleep. And you might think, oh, why does sleep matter? Well, short sleep durations or difficulty consistently having restful sleep is sort of a well-established risk factor for ongoing difficulties with health, well-being, and function. You can sort of appreciate this. So here's a comparison to the Canadian Community Health Survey. About 85% of working adults in Ontario, 85% say that they never to sometimes have trouble going to sleep or staying asleep. In comparison, in the OLAWIS cohort, you can see that there are much higher proportions of people who say most or all of the time I have trouble going to sleep or staying asleep compared to working adults in Ontario. Pain interfering with normal activities during the past 4 weeks. How much did pain interfere with your normal work? And here the idea of work generalizes to all the activities of your daily life. Unfortunately, the Canadian Community Health Survey doesn't in our view, doesn't have adequate measures of pain interfering with normal activities. But you can see here again the differences across these three groups, that the members of the two longer duration or longer WSIB service groups are experiencing at 18 months, this is the past 4 weeks, 18 months after a work-related injury, are reporting quite a bit or extreme pain interference, 25% in sample group 2, almost 50% in sample group 3. Okay, changing again to another measure of health. This is a comparison between the OLAWIS cohort, lost time claimants, and the CCHS working adults in Ontario, asking them, had a physician ever diagnosed the following conditions? These are chronic conditions. In other words, they are expected to last 6 months or longer. And we used exactly the same questions in the OLAWIS questionnaire as the CCHS used. For the OLAWIS participants, we asked them first, had a physician diagnosed any of these chronic conditions before your injury? And that's what this comparison is. So in the case of diabetes, the CCHS working adults prevalence rate is about 6.5%. For the OLAWIS cohort, it's about 8%. For asthma, the OLAWIS cohort has a higher prevalence. I think that's something we would say. For the mood disorder, the prevalence is again higher in the OLAWIS cohort. This is before injury. And also for migraine, the prevalence of migraine among the OLAWIS cohort pre-injury was higher than in the CCHS sample. But for high blood pressure, back problems, and arthritis, essentially it's the same prevalence. So one way to think about what this is telling us is, or the question, the information this can provide is, before injury, were last time claimants, did last time claimants have a higher burden of chronic condition compared to working adults in Ontario? And you can interpret this a couple of different ways. I think our interpretation, my interpretation, is generally no, or put it another way, that the health status of last time claimants pre-injury looked a lot like that of working adults in Ontario. But here's a concern. Next slide. So what we've added here is the information interview participants told us about a diagnosis of a chronic condition after the injury. So that's the dark blue line. It's added to the light blue bar, which is a diagnosis received before injury. So in the case of diabetes, only a small increase in prevalence post-injury. In the case of asthma, only a small increase. In the case of high blood pressure, an increase, but again, a small increase. But there are 4 conditions where the prevalence almost doubles. Mood disorder, migraine, a pain condition, back problems, and arthritis. And this doubling of a prevalence of physician-diagnosed chronic conditions is important for us to understand. What is it? Where is it coming from? It's a much higher incident rate over 18 months than we would expect would happen, in a sense, naturally. I'll go on. This slide I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but it's the characteristics that correlate with a new chronic condition diagnosis. So in other words, in the group of people who told us that a physician had diagnosed one of the 7 chronic conditions in the last 18 months, what are the things that correlate with it? Well, one of the things that correlates, well, first of all, age and sex doesn't, but the nature of the work-related injury does. So here we're reporting odds ratios where the reference group are workers whose injury was in the category of abrasion contusion. So head injury is associated with a greater likelihood of a new chronic condition diagnosis. Musculoskeletal disorders, almost statistically significant. Other injury types, which is a diverse category, was also associated with it. Pain at a severity of quite a bit or extreme was associated with a new chronic condition diagnosis. Was the person currently receiving health care at 18 months after the injury for the work-related condition? That's associated with a new chronic condition diagnosis. People who told us they were unemployed, that's associated with a new chronic condition diagnosis. And low levels of education was also associated with it. So a preliminary interpretation of this information about chronic conditions would go something like this, that the pre-injury prevalence of physician-diagnosed chronic conditions in our cohort was generally similar to chronic disease prevalence among working adults in Ontario. For a number of conditions, the incidence, that's new conditions, in the 18-month period following injury, it's elevated in the OLAWIS cohort. And 2 thoughts, a small proportion of this elevated incidence of chronic conditions we can probably attribute to enhanced case finding during the clinical treatment of work-related injury or illness. So I'm personally a good example of this. There was a time when I might not see a physician more frequently than once every 5 years, but when I do, I get a workup, get some blood work done. The physician might say, your blood pressure is a little high. That's what we're talking about when we say enhanced case finding. But alternatively, personally, I think the majority of the elevated incidence, we have to look carefully to understand the degree to which it perhaps can be attributed to conditions that have arisen secondary to the original work-related injury or illness. I'm going to give a sketch now of a second piece of analysis, which was focused on the question, do poor case manager interactions, so this is a WSIB case manager, do they increase the likelihood of a worker experiencing a serious mental illness following a physical workplace injury or illness? So as I think a great deal of research is established over the last 20 years, some of it from the Institute for Work and Health. It's common, unfortunately, among workers recovering from work-related injury or illness that symptoms of mental health disorder are elevated. And what we've done here is looked at the relationship between, what I'm about to show you, looked at the relationship between poor case manager interactions and the probability of experiencing a serious mental illness at the 18-month period following a work-related injury or illness. The measure of serious mental illness is a psychological distress scale. It's got 6 items on it. Respondents who scored more than 12 on this scale were defined as having the probability of a serious mental illness. And in this cohort, the prevalence of high K6 scores at 18 months was about 15%. So prevalence means 15 out of every 100 people had a high K6 score at 18 months. Okay. Here's a profile of what survey participants told us about their interactions with WSIB case managers, and it's broken into two broad categories. There's 7 questions here, but 2 categories. What was the quality of interpersonal interaction? Were you treated politely? Were you treated with dignity and respect? 8 out of 10 people said, yep, I was. And this is largely consistent with the perception surveys that the WSIB administers regularly to understand the satisfaction of workers with their services. Another category of questions, the quality of information. 5 questions here. They're less strongly endorsed, but they are all endorsed more positively than negatively. But I think it's useful to distinguish between the quality of the interpersonal interaction and the quality of the information that was shared. So what we have done with this information is grouped claimants, and these are the rows, into 4 groups in terms of the quality of the interaction. A group of people who reported high quality interpersonal interaction, about 40%, a group of people who said the quality was good, a much smaller group who said the quality was low, as we classified them, and then a group of people who had no case manager. These would be people whose durations of wage replacement benefits were quite short, typically. And there is an association both in terms of interpersonal interaction and the quality of information. There's an association with the worker perceiving low quality case manager interactions and the probability of high K6 scores, which is indicating a risk of serious mental illness. So interpretation for this work, first of all, the majority of claimants, and this is important, report positive interactions with WSIB case managers. It's a tough job being a case manager. Doing it well is important, and the information from the claimants that we spoke to said, 4 times out of 5, the case manager interaction was positive. However, for a minority of claimants, and that's about 10%, case manager interactions were reported to be negative. And there was an association between perceptions of poor case manager interactions and the probability of having elevated K6 score, which is indicative of serious mental illness. And the final bullet point here just notes, and certainly all human service organizations recognize this, that through standards, program standards and training, the quality of case manager interactions is potentially modifiable. Okay, so I'm now just going to wrap it up and then share a few thoughts about where we're going to go next. 3 thoughts. 18 months after a work-related injury or illness, among lost time claimants, approximately 65% have ongoing employment with the at-injury employer. Among those claimants who are no longer with the at-injury employer, about 35% told us that part of the reason why they were no longer at the injury employer related to concerns about health, either their own health or their apprehension that the accommodation available was not satisfactory or suitable for their health. Second observation, that using the prevalence of chronic condition as our marker, the health status of workers in the OLAWIS study was similar to working age adults in Ontario before injury. But 18 months after injury, there's an important number of workers in our study group who reported poor physical and mental health. And the final observation is that this study design, which recruits, interviews workers 18 months after a work-related injury or illness, typically long after the period of services from the WSIB has concluded. It's a really important method for understanding both employment status and health status of lost time claimants. Absolutely important. So as we go forward into 2021, we'll be addressing these 7 questions, these 7 pieces of work. We want to understand more about the chronic condition incident following work injury. We want to do some work on therapeutic cannabis use in this cohort, and I'll give you a bit more on that in a second. We want to understand more clearly the predictors and the correlates of persistent pain in this cohort. And as I summarized, we have already done some work on case manager interactions and claimant mental health. In terms of workplace return to work practices, there's an important amount of information that we have available from claimants. We'd like to know more about what it is in a workplace that predicts the offer of modified duty and accommodation offers, and also what the quality of those accommodations are. We're currently doing some work identifying the characteristics of workers and workplaces and sectors that are predictors of successful return to work. And related to that, we're interested in the question, are there differences in accommodation practices at the workplace level across economic sectors? We can represent about 10 economic sectors among the more than 1,000 study participants in this cohort. Here's a sketch about cannabis use. On the right-hand side, what Canadian workers have told an Institute study team, the use of cannabis in the past 12 months, Canadian workers 29%, and among WSIB lost time claimants recovering from a work-related injury or illness, but exactly the same number. We also have information on who among the past 12 months cannabis users are using it for therapeutic purposes. Right? And in the case of the OLAWIS study, 43% told us, 43% of the 29%, if you're with me, not quite half of the 29%, said they reported using cannabis for the treatment of the condition or conditions arising from their work-related injury or illness. And about 30% are using, about 30% of those people using cannabis for therapeutic purposes told us they were using it under a medical prescription. So the other way around, 70% are not using it under a medical prescription. We want to know more about this. And so in terms of additional work in progress, my colleague Nancy Carnide, Peter Smith, who's curating this call, have been funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research to look in more detail at understanding cannabis use and its relationship with long-term recovery and return to work in this very same cohort. So this study group is currently re-interviewing the 96% of the OLAWIS cohort who agreed to be re-interviewed. They are now being re-interviewed 36 months following a work-related injury or illness. We are asking questions, many questions similar to the questions that we asked in the first survey wave, but we also have a supplemental set of questions to understand in more detail cannabis use in this cohort. Interviewing starts this month. And a second piece of work that's in planning, this is at the proposal stage, is some work that I'll be leading also with Dr. Smith and Carnide to recruit 700 Ontario workers, lost time claimants, whose claim was registered in the pre-COVID period, October 2019 to February 2020, but whose recovery and return to work occurred in the shadow cast by the COVID-19 emergency. So if you can sort of picture what we're proposing to do, a group of people whose disabling injury occurred 6 months before the COVID-19 emergency started, we're going to interview those people 18 to 20 months after the onset of their disabling injury, focusing both on their health but particularly on their labor market experiences. And that will provide a comparison to the group of people, the 1,100 Ontario workers who participated with us in the OLAWIS cohort. That's my summary. Thank you very much. For more information from us on a regular basis, it's simple, just sign up and subscribe. Peter, over to you.
Thanks very much, Cam. Just a reminder for those who have joined us late, if you do want to ask a question, please, if you could put it in the chat box, and hopefully we'll get to all the questions we have today, although we already have a number of questions that have been listed in there. But please put your questions in the chat box and we'll ask them in order. So thanks very much for that, Cam. I've got a couple of questions, as I said already here. A few of them are just about the sample and who was excluded from the sample and potential impacts of that. So the first is around those who still had an active claim at the 18-month mark. What percentage of claimants in the regular intake of the WSIB would fall into that category where they still have an active claim at the 18-month mark?
I think our WSIB colleagues on this call may have a better estimate. I think it's 1 or 2%, maybe 3%, Peter.
Okay. And in terms of people who had a claim which was denied, they won't be in the cohort. Did you have any thoughts on the experiences of people who have put in a claim but then it's been denied?
Well, first of all, it's absolutely accurate observation that claims that were submitted but not accepted, those individuals could not be recruited into this study. If there was let me put it this way, it would be important to know more about that group of people for sure.
Great. So the next question is, going back to the information you presented about the claim agent interactions in this cohort. And this question is about whether you had looked at differences across the claim agent interactions within the 3 samples in the study. So the people with short duration, longer duration, and the longest duration. Have you looked at the claim agent interactions across the groups and were there differences?
I think the way I would describe what we found, Peter, is that there were differences. It was more likely that a worker who was in our second or our third sample group, so longer duration of services from the WSIB, it was more likely to hear of, it was more common to report negative interactions compared to the first sample group who had shorter durations. That said, when we looked analytically at the characteristics of both the worker, the workplace, and the interactions with case managers, analytically, the differences between those 3 sample groups were largely accounted for, but I don't know that that's particularly relevant, but I think the observation from the person asking the question is correct, that participants who were in the longer duration sample groups were more likely to report negative interactions.
And I think they had described that, I guess, and they've heard that the longer a claim is active, there's a greater increase in dissatisfaction in terms of the interactions with the WSIB staff with longer durations. The claim is active.
I think that.
The next one is around for people who were not currently employed. Has any information been collected on the types of supports that they're currently accessing around unemployment insurance, disability, pensions? Is any information being collected among that group to better understand income supports if they're no longer working?
That's a good question. We do have information. I didn't share it with you here. We do have information from the survey participants about the sources of household income in the 12 months before the interview. So this is in the post-injury period. But what I think I can say, and I apologize, we haven't looked at that in detail, and I take the interest of the person asking the question that this should be something we should look at. The reasons that people gave when we asked them why they're not currently working, I think can loosely be put into 4 categories. About 45% of people not currently working said, well, I'm not working because my health is poor. Okay, that's a big number, right? 45% said, I can't work because my health is poor. About 20% said I've retired, which is, I think an outcome that is not unrelated to having a work-related injury or illness. About 20% said, well, I'm not working, but I'm looking for work. And then about another 20% told us the reason they were not working was a composite of different things. They were going to school, they'd chosen to care for their family member, they were taking a break from work. But I think the dominant reason people gave us for not currently working was that they felt their health was just too poor.
Okay. Another question just around, has any information been collected on race or ethnicity, and are there plans to examine that in this particular cohort?
We did ask people to offer a self-identification in terms of ethnicity. Yes. Okay. We also have information. We also asked people about their residency in Canada. Are they an immigrant? If they're an immigrant, if they have immigrated to Canada, when did they come?
Okay. So there's a question around the publication of the study findings, which at the moment there are a few papers which are under review, but nothing yet has been published from the study. Just for that particular question, I can answer that one myself. The other one is about the sleep quality. So someone was saying that was really interesting. Are there plans to further understand issues associated with sleep quality among this group of injured workers?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question and the endorsement that this is, I think, important. Yes, we are. I think personally, to see the degree of difference that we're seeing around sleep quality among this group of people is really important to describe clearly. And then I think we sort of have a responsibility to try to think about, well, therapeutically, clinically, what's the remedy here to try to alleviate some of this burden. But yes, Peter, we will be doing work on this.
Okay. Another question around the employment arrangements that the worker had prior to getting injured. So if they were in standard full-time work, part-time work, employed through a temporary agency, has that type of information been collected, and will it be examined?
Great question. Yes. So we asked people about their pre-injury employment. We asked people about what their tenure had been with the employer, what their employment relationship was. Were they a permanent employee? Were they on a temporary employment contract? Were they a union member? The size of the workplace, the sector that the employer was in. So that information is actually very important. About 10% of people told us that their pre-injury employment relationship was not permanent. So in other words, they were on a contract or temporary employment. And we will be looking more closely at the experiences of that group of people who had, well, let's just say they had a weaker employment relationship. It increases the probability that their experience post-injury, certainly around returning to work at the injury employer, will be less successful. But it may be that there are other consequences as well in terms of getting back into the labor market. So it's an important group that we want to know more about. About 50% of the cohort told us that they were in a unionized workplace.
In terms of the results you reported today on chronic conditions, there's a question about whether the number of conditions was a predictor of having additional conditions diagnosed. So do people with a lot of chronic conditions tend to have more conditions diagnosed, or was it, how did that look?
That's a great question. That's something that we're going to be looking at, and actually currently are looking at it, both chronic conditions in terms of the numbers and pre-injury, and chronic conditions that have been diagnosed post-injury. You know, I just want to sidebar on this for a moment. If I wasn't moving too quickly as I went through those particular figures, the conditions where the incidence went up dramatically over 18 months were conditions that, I mean, a clinician would recognize as sort of primarily involving the musculoskeletal system. So arthritis, the musculoskeletal conditions was back problems was another one. And there is a clinical literature, I don't find it particularly clear, but there is a clinical literature that identifies something called a condition called post-traumatic osteoarthritis. So it's not unusual to find it among professional athletes. The epidemiology of members of the military, who unfortunately do more likely to experience traumatic injury in the course of their service. These professions are more likely to present over time with this syndrome, post-traumatic osteoarthritis, which is linking together a traumatic injury with a chronic osteoarthritic condition. So I think, Peter, we want to know more about what we're seeing here, and potentially make a contribution to the literature and to the administration of benefits and work disability schemes, because this is a concerning increase in the prevalence of conditions that is not well documented, I think, in the epidemiologic literature around the consequences of traumatic injury.
Here's another question, which is, I guess, related to poor health. You had mentioned before that there was a sizable proportion of people who are not currently working who said that was due to their health status. They couldn't work at the moment due to their health. Do you have a sense, in terms of that group, how much of their health status was related to the work injury that had occurred?
Yeah, good question. I think if I understand the question, it's pointing to the important distinction between somebody who says, I'm not working because of my health, and it's a health condition, let's just say arthritis, that's unrelated to the work-related injury, versus somebody who has told us that they're not currently working because, let's use another example, because of a persistent pain condition that arose with the work-related injury and has continued, right? Can we distinguish between those two? I'm not sure, but it's a great question, and we'll go back and have a look. Thank you.
Okay. In terms of the people who are working with a new employer, so didn't return to work with their pre-existing employer, has information been collected on whether they were working in the same type of job, whether they were receiving the same type of wage at the new employer that they were working with?
No, great question. Yes, we have that information. The particular comparison that this question implies is there new employment the same as the previous employment in terms of the quality of the employment, the occupational opportunity, the income? That's a great question. We'll look at that one. Thank you.
Just around the sample and the survey, were the surveys only conducted in English? And if people couldn't understand English, were there options available for them?
It's a great question. English or French? The survey was available. So the question leads to an important observation. If a lost time claimant did not have the facility to conduct an interview in English or French, or had a proxy available in their household to speak on their behalf, we couldn't include them in the survey.
So now there are a few questions which generally fall into the issue around pre-existing health conditions, so things that existed prior to the injury and how they might impact different health outcomes. So for example, in the analyses where you've looked at mental health status at 18 months, were pre-existing mental health conditions taken into account prior to the injury in those analyses?
And the answer is yes, they were. We specifically excluded people who told us that they had a diagnosis of a mood disorder prior to the injury.
In terms of people who are not currently employed, has information been collected on whether they were doing anything else, such as engaged in retraining, had gone back to school? I guess, was things collected on those types of activities if they weren't currently in the labour market?
We do have that information. I think, well, let me put it this way. It's not 10% of people who are not currently working who told us that they were either participating in a WSIB sponsored work reintegration training program, or they themselves were going back to school. It's not 10%, but it's more than 5%.
Right. We're almost at the end of our questions now, Cam. We just have a couple more minutes to go. In terms of the work that you described around the potential for collecting a new cohort of workers' compensation claimants who have, I guess, had the workers' compensation process occur during COVID, do you have any hypotheses on what differences you might expect if you were to recruit that cohort compared to the cohort that you're currently that you've presented on today?
I think the expectation that I would have is that the health and function consequences of a work-related injury in the cohort that we're planning to recruit will probably not be different compared to the 1,100 people who spoke to us between June of 2019 and March of 2020. But alternatively, I think the return to work experiences are going to be dramatically different. It's just the intersection of how many employers currently have employees who are working remotely, the collapse of some important sectors in terms of employment. So the hospitality, food, as a sector, for an example, and just the challenges of working and returning to work in the environment of essential service work. I think it's just going to be dramatically different, Peter. I would expect, unfortunately, to see a higher proportion of people telling us that no, they're not working. And there may be a smaller group of people who tell us they've returned to work at the out of injury employer. That would be my expectation at this point.
Okay. Great. One small question, and then I guess a clarification. In terms of the sample, it does contain workers who are in the construction industry. Do you have a sense of how many people in the sample were in the construction industry?
Thanks, great question. So the representation of the economic sectors in our cohort is almost a mirror of the Ontario labor market. So 6 or 7 or 8% of us in Ontario work in construction, 6 or 7 or 8%. It's a little bit higher because of the higher risk of a work-related injury in construction compared to some other sectors. But it's almost a mirror. So it's probably about 8% in construction.
Great, thank you. And just to confirm, in terms of the slides for today's presentations and the recording, they will be put up on the speaker series webpage. Okay. Yes?
Oh, you're asking me?
I'm asking you. Yeah, sorry to put you on the spot.
That's okay. I would think they would be. I would think.
So for those who joined us late or want to revisit the slides, they will be put up on the speaker series webpage. Usually you get them up within a week or 2 weeks or so. So thank you again, Cam, for the presentation today. Just a reminder to those who want to keep up to date with information at the Institute for Work and Health, you can subscribe by clicking or going to iwh.on.ca/subscribe. If you do want more information on the speaker series events, you can also grab that on our webpage under the events tab with speaker series. Just to remind people, our next speaker series presentation will be on February the 23rd, where IWH scientist Arif Jetha will be reporting on some trends in the future of work. So please, you can register for that on our webpage at the moment, and you can, and we hope to see you all join us then. Lots of people thanking you for the presentation, Cam, as well. I'll add my thanks to that as well. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you again at the next speaker series presentation. Bye-bye.